Hello and welcome to the Beyond Fluency Podcast. My name is Ramps, and if you've been following our channel for a while, you know that we love exploring practical, everyday, real-life English that goes beyond the textbook lessons. And so today is no different as we dive into the topic that is probably important for every working professional: giving and receiving feedback politely. Now, whether you're in a meeting, a presentation, or a coaching session, the ability to give feedback in a respectful, clear, and concise manner is a crucial skill. So let's get into it. Now, I believe it goes without saying that when it comes to feedback, whether you are giving the feedback or receiving the feedback, it should be done gracefully. Now, you may be asking yourself the question, what is the meaning of gracefully? To do something gracefully or to do something with grace means to do it in a polite and pleasant manner. Now, I'm sure you can see how and why it would be important in feedback to do it gracefully. The place I'd like to start today is inviting feedback. If you'd like others to share their thoughts with you, it is important for us to be open and receptive. Of course, we can do that using language. A good example of this is in the goal setting episode. In the middle of the conversation, there's a point at which I'm encouraging Liam to give me some feedback.
Learning English because you have a very definite idea of how you want to use it. You want to become a CEO, for example. This is a very clear purpose. That's the guide for everything else that comes after it.
I have a few questions, if I may. Please correct me again. What was the meaning of MTP?
Massively transformative purpose.
Now, in the video we just watched, I used two phrases to encourage Liam to give me additional information. So in other words, to give me a little bit more feedback. The two phrases that I used were, I have a few questions, if I may. And the second phrase was, please correct me again. Now, the second phrase that I used, please correct me again, is a variation of the more commonly used phrase, please correct me if I'm wrong. Let's have a look at a few clips of how this phrase, please correct me if I'm wrong, can be used.
Please correct me if I'm wrong here.
Well, and please correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I think what Marcy's saying, Linda, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Marcy, I don't want to be off base here.
I'm sure you recognize some of those film scenes and probably also recognize that the phrase, please correct me if I'm wrong, can be used in various ways. We have looked at it from a feedback point of view, but obviously in this clips, it's used as well as a form of clarification. But back to the feedback. These phrases are perfect for inviting feedback without sounding defensive. They show you're asking for input, which automatically means that you value the input of others. Now, once the feedback is given to you, we want to equally accept and acknowledge the feedback with grace. And once again, we can look to language to do so. Going back to the goal setting episode, there were two phrases that once again were used to do exactly that.
You're way ahead of me, buddy. That's the next stage. It's a hierarchy. So at the top, you have your MTP. This is the ultimate goal. Okay. Beneath that, you have your high hard goals. These are the things that are difficult, but they are the sub steps to achieve your MTP. Okay. And then from the high hard goals, you have clear goals, which are your daily steps to achieve your high hard goals. Your high hard goals are the building blocks to achieve your MTP. So you breaking it down into smaller pieces as you come down the hierarchy.
Thanks. And I stand corrected. Yes, you did mention that it is a hierarchy.
Stand corrected, madam. I stand corrected.
I often say, presenting, public speaking is almost like acting. Good actors are good because they don't look like they're acting.
Right.
Great publics, if they look like they're acting, they're not good actors. Think of anyone that you consider a great public speaker. You know that person rehearses probably, or the likelihood that they rehearse is high. The likelihood that maybe they practice is high. But whenever you see them speak, it never feels like they've rehearsed the conversation, the dialogue. I think of Simon Sinek almost immediately. Mm-hmm. He's just so good as a public speaker.
I think this is a good point.
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's a good point, David.
That's a good point.
The phrases were, I stand corrected, and that's a good point. When we say I stand corrected, you're showing that you respect what has been said and are willing to learn. And more so, you are also being quite open and transparent about having made a mistake. Now, in certain instances, it may be uncomfortable to say I am wrong. So the phrase I stand corrected allows us to some level, save face while still being honest, which is great in building rapport and trust between any two parties. The second phrase was, that's a good point. It's a great way to acknowledge someone else's point of view. Now, of course, inviting feedback is only one part of it. At times, we are the ones giving feedback. Now, perhaps when we are the ones giving feedback, the language that we use may become a little bit more important, particularly when it comes to word choice. We want to stay away from language or words that could potentially make whatever we say sound overly critical, harsh, or perhaps even dismissive. A good example of this can be found in both the goal setting episode as well as the flow episode. Let's have a look at it. Could we maybe break it down into smaller goals, letting those smaller goals, titling them perhaps as milestones in order to build up to the big goal? Could it be just as effective?
Could we maybe get a drink and talk later?
Could we maybe put them someplace else?
If we pay extra, could we maybe get some grease or fat?
But what I can say about flow in terms of language learning is observe it. It's like observe the moments in which you're in flow and be aware of those moments and maybe try to understand what it is about those moments.
Now, the phrase that I used from the goal setting episode was, could we maybe break it down into smaller goals? Now, in English, whenever we are trying to be polite or perhaps being a little bit persuasive through politeness, we often use modal verbs. In this case, we use could. Right? I then double down on this by using the word maybe. Could we maybe break this down into smaller goals? Something along the lines of that. The use of the word maybe itself is often used when giving suggestions in a way that is polite and not aggressive or forceful. Now, in the flow episode, what I said was, observe the moments in which you're in flow. Try to understand what it is about those moments. I perhaps maybe go on to say that makes you feel at ease, something along the lines of that. Now, in this case, I didn't use the word could again, but simply maybe, because similar to could, when we are giving suggestions and we don't want to be overly aggressive, we often use maybe. Now, something I haven't mentioned up to this point is intonation. Maybe scroll back to the videos, particularly to the parts where I've used clips from films, and look at how differently some of the phrases are said and how the intonation changes slightly the meaning. See if you can guess what each of the expressions or how each of the expressions we looked at changed with the intonation in relation to meaning. By phrasing feedback in this way, you are suggesting an idea rather than dictating it. That allows for it to become a more of a collaborative conversation. It also is quite a respectful way to approach it, which is key when giving feedback. People want to be heard as much as they want to listen. There are other ways, of course, that we can use in order for us to give feedback. Another method we can use is softening phrases. Now, softening phrases are quite common in the English language. You may have come across phrases like a bit, a little, sort of, kind of. Whenever we say something that could either be offensive or negative, we tend to use these softening phrases to make it less direct, allowing it to be a little bit more polite. So you may hear people say things like,
since it was a bit of meteorite a million billion years ago.
And you have to admit, it was a bit old-fashioned.
It was just I kind of dabbled in that world, and for me it was a bit much.
Other examples of softening phrases are, I'd suggest doing this or that or that. What if we tried it this way? These type of phrases show that you're offering suggestions or recommendations, not demanding changes. This makes the feedback feel less like criticism and more like a constructive conversation. Another softening technique that we use is using neutral to informal language. In formal situations like feedback, we tend to use formal language a lot. However, the inclusion of neutral and informal language allows feedback to be a little bit less stressful, perhaps even for the person on the receiving end of it, as well as a little bit more collaborative once again. Phrasal verbs like look out and break down and get cracking can all be used to frame feedback in a clear and approachable manner and softening whatever is being said. Here are a few examples of how we could use the phrasal verbs. Let me lay out the steps for how we're going to achieve this task. Let's break it down into smaller parts so it's easier to follow. We need to get cracking on this project, so let's start with the most urgent task. These structures give your feedback clarity, structure, and urgency without being forceful. Now, of course, at times, irrespective of how we try to approach it, disagreements do occur. Disagreements are normal, perhaps more so in professional work environments. But whenever we do find ourselves in these situations, it's important to be respectful. Once again, in the flow episode, we can find 1 or 2 examples of how to disagree with someone diplomatically, politely, in a manner that is not offensive. The 2 phrases that I'd like to highlight are,
That's a fair point.
Okay, that's a fair point.
That's a fair point, but that's just not how business works.
that's a fair point. Here's another way to look at it. I might have to look that up. When you use a phrase like, that's a fair point, and then add your own perspective, you're showing that you're open to different and new ideas. You're not just shutting down the other person's thoughts, but you're adding your own in a more balanced, respectful way. And of course, the phrase, I might have to look that up, quite similar to, I stand corrected, is a great way to admit that you don't know something whilst saving face, and at the same time, building trust and rapport. And then, of course, whenever we speak about feedback, mistakes are going to be mentioned. So it is important that we mention some of the mistakes. What we need to do, however, is normalize the mistakes and simultaneously encourage fixing of it. It's important to create a safe space whenever giving feedback. Mistakes are part of the learning process, and the language that you use can make a huge difference. In Flow, there are a few phrases that we used that helps normalize mistakes while simultaneously encourages to fix them.
I think a nice phrase that I like to use with people, which you can kind of use in this situation, is sometimes you win and sometimes you learn. And this is just a learning opportunity.
The phrases I'm talking about are, sometimes you win and sometimes you learn. Making mistakes is a good thing. Saying things like sometimes you win and sometimes you learn helps normalize failure, while simultaneously encourages self-reflection. It removes the pressure and allows for growth. Encouragement, as we said, plays a big role in giving feedback. Phrases like, be kind to yourself, start small, just keep going. These kind of phrases create a positive atmosphere and remind people that feedback is part of the growth process. So, I hope you enjoyed today's episode and you found some value in it. I'd like to challenge you for this week to pick 1 phrase from today and try to use it in your next conversation, next email, your English journal, and tell us how it goes in the comment section. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Cheers.